July 12, 1945, 7:10 in the morning, Camp Rupert, Idaho. The rising sun cast a dull orange haze over the distant sagebrush fields as the Hungarian prisoners of war lined up for morning roll call. Among them stood István Farkas, a 26-year-old former baker from Szeged, who hadn't seen yeast or olive oil in years. His uniform hung loosely on his frame, a reminder of rationed meals and long days of labor. The men beside him were farmers, teachers and soldiers, survivors of the Eastern Front, now thousands of miles from home in a land they barely understood. The day's bulletin brought unexpected news. 20 of them, including István, had been assigned work detail in town at a place called Tony's Pizzeria. The word meant nothing to them. Pizza was an unfamiliar sound, a foreign rhythm that rolled off the tongue with strange curiosity. The men whispered among themselves, wondering what sort of factory or workshop this pizzeria might be. To them, American work meant machines, not ovens. As they climbed aboard the olive-green army truck, István muttered to his closest friend, Laszlo, a former schoolteacher, "If it's food, it'll be bland." These Americans boil everything. Even their bread looks pale. Laszlo chuckled. Maybe they'll let you bake something decent, just like back home. The laughter masked their exhaustion. None of them knew that by sundown they would encounter something that would redefine their understanding of food, freedom, and culture itself. The truck rolled down a gravel road that led to the heart of Rupert, a modest American town with wide streets, wooden storefronts, and waving flags on every corner. They passed a barber shop, a gas station, and a diner with a glowing red sign. Then the truck stopped in front of a small building with smoke gently rising from a brick chimney. The sign above the door read, in proud block letters, Tony's Pizzeria, real Italian flavor. The prisoners hesitated. An Italian name in Idaho. It felt absurd. To men raised on cabbage soup and soldier's bread, Italian flavor sounded like wartime propaganda. A young American sergeant waved them forward. "All right, fellas, this is your stop. Be on your best behavior. Tony's a good man inside." The air was warm and thick with the smell of yeast, tomatoes, and melting cheese, a scent none of them had ever experienced. It was both earthy and electric, alive with something new. Tony DeMarco, the owner, stood behind a wooden counter dusted with flour. A broad-shouldered man with dark hair and sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked nothing like the stern military cooks the POWs were used to. "Welcome, boys!" Tony's voice boomed with an accent that blended Italy and America in equal measure. "You're going to help me today. Wash, chop, stir, but mostly watch. I'll show you how we make a real American pizza." István blinked. "American pizza?" he repeated under his breath. The irony escaped no one. Even the name sounded confused. Italian food made by Americans, served in a landlocked town full of cowboys. Tony grinned as if he'd heard the thought. "Pizza's Italian, sure, but here we make it our way." You'll see the prisoners exchanged doubtful looks as Tony reached into a large wooden bowl filled with dough. He began stretching it, tossing it lightly into the air with practiced rhythm. The dough floated and spun, catching the light before landing softly on his knuckles. The movement was hypnotic, precise, effortless, confident. István couldn't look away. He had spent years kneading bread, but this technique was different. Tony didn't just prepare dough, he performed with it. The air smelled of yeast and wood smoke, layered with something richer, tomato sauce simmering on the stove, bubbling with garlic and herbs that filled the room with sharp, intoxicating notes. "Smells like home, doesn't it?" Tony said with a wink. "Except better." István tried to hide a smile. "It smells alive. Tony nodded. That's America for you. By noon, the first pizzas emerged from the oven. Thin crusts blistered to golden perfection, edges puffed with heat, cheese bubbling like sunlight trapped in dough. The prisoners watched as Tony sliced a pie cleanly into triangles and handed them each a slice on paper plates. "Go on." "Try it," Tony said. The men hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. Food in captivity was functional. Bread, beans, rations. This looked indulgent. Laszlo took the first bite. His eyes widened. "It's soft and crisp." "The sauce, what is that?" Tony laughed. "Tomatoes, garlic, olive oil." Simple István followed, biting carefully. The dough crackled, the cheese stretched, the sauce burst with flavor. It was unlike anything he'd ever tasted, rich, bright, and strangely emotional. For a moment, the world outside disappeared. The prisoners ate silently, lost in the experience. For the first time since the war began, they tasted something made not for survival, but for joy. As they finished, Tony leaned on the counter. "You see, pizza's not about fancy ingredients, it's about balance. You get that right, and you get happiness on a plate." István nodded slowly, eyes distant. "In Hungary, food is heavy, serious. This is like music." Tony smiled. "That's the point. In America, even food has freedom." That night, back in the barracks, the prisoners spoke in hushed tones. The conversation wasn't about work or discipline, it was about flavor, about the dough's warmth, the sauce's brightness, the feeling of being human again, if only for a meal. For István, something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't just about taste, it was about meaning. The idea that food could be simple and joyful, yet profound, was revolutionary. He lay awake long after lights out, imagining himself not as a prisoner, but as a baker again, free to create. When morning came, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. July 13th, 1945, 9 in the morning, Tony's Pizzeria, Rupert, Idaho. The prisoners arrived earlier than usual. None of them wanted to miss the first whiff of that now familiar aroma of baking dough and simmering tomato sauce. Tony greeted them with his usual cheerful grin, his white apron dusted with flour and his eyes alive with the satisfaction of a man doing what he loved. "Morning, boys," he said, clapping his hands together. "Today we go beyond tasting. Today you learn to make pizza." The men exchanged uncertain glances. In the world they came from, food preparation was often routine mechanical a task for women or servants. But Tony's kitchen ran differently. It was a stage. He moved through it with confidence and joy, orchestrating every movement with deliberate rhythm. He didn't command through fear, but through passion. He began by showing them the dough. Flour, water, yeast, salt, and time. That's all. But if you rush it, you kill it. If you care for it, you bring it to life. István stepped closer, fascinated by the texture. The dough was soft but strong. When Tony pressed his fingers into it, it rose gently, pushing back like something breathing. It was a living thing. The concept was simple, yet profound. As the day went on, Tony introduced them to each element. He showed them the sauce made from crushed tomatoes, simmered with garlic and basil. He spoke of balance, not excess flavor, not quantity. He grated cheese by hand, explaining how heat and patience mattered more than expensive ingredients. "You know what makes pizza American?" Tony asked while sliding a tray into the brick oven. "We take what's old and make it new. We don't ask permission, we just do." Laszlo nodded slowly. "In Hungary, we guard tradition." Maybe too much. Tony smiled. "Tradition's good. But if you let it chain you, you stop growing." The words lingered in the air, heavier than the heat of the oven. They were about more than food. They were about life. By afternoon, the prisoners were kneading dough under Tony's watchful eye. István's hands remembered the craft. He found rhythm again, the soft slap of dough against the counter, the rise and fall of the rolling pin. He felt purpose, a sense of control that captivity had stripped away. Tony corrected gently, "More air in your folds, let it breathe." "Don't force it." István nodded, adjusting his technique. When he looked up, Tony was watching him with a proud grin. "You've got it." "You're a baker, huh?" "Yes, before the war." István replied quietly, "In Szeged." Tony's expression softened. "Then you already understand. The dough only lives when the hands that shape it believe in life." Later that evening, they gathered around the long wooden table as their first homemade pizzas baked. The aroma filled every corner of the room, carrying a strange sense of peace. The American soldiers who guarded them leaned casually against the doorframes, curious but smiling. The sight of former enemies working together in harmony was something rare. When the pizzas came out, the men stood silently. Tony cut slices and handed them around with paper plates. "Your turn to taste your own work." István bit into his slice. The crust cracked softly beneath his teeth. The cheese stretched like spun gold. The sauce danced with flavor that was sharp but comforting. It wasn't just food. It was creation reborn. "This is freedom," Laszlo whispered without thinking. Tony looked up from the counter. "That's right. Food tells you what freedom feels like before your mind even understands it." In the following weeks, the pizzeria became their classroom, their refuge, their glimpse into another world. Tony taught them more than recipes. He taught them the rhythm of American enterprise, how hard work and creativity could coexist, how innovation was a kind of rebellion that didn't need violence. One afternoon, Tony gathered them around the prep table and held up a single pizza topped with pepperoni, a new ingredient for them. "See this," he said. "This is the first pizza in Idaho with pepperoni on it. You know why? Because someone asked me last week if I could make it spicier. So I tried. That's what we do here. We try." The simplicity of the statement struck the prisoners deeply. In their homeland, experimentation often invited punishment. Here, it invited praise. Every failure was a lesson, not a shame. As summer deepened, their time in town became the highlight of each day. American customers would sometimes stop by to watch them work, curious to see the foreign laborers learning Italian-American cuisine. Some even spoke kindly to them, offering small talk and cigarettes. For men who had been treated as enemies, the smallest gesture of kindness felt revolutionary. One evening after the last customer left, Tony poured them each a small glass of Coca-Cola and raised his own in a toast. To learning something new every day, that's the American way. They drank silently, the fizz tickling their throats, the sweetness foreign yet strangely comforting. When the guards led them back to camp that night, the sky burned orange above the Idaho fields. István looked back at the pizzeria, the neon sign flickering softly against the dark. For the first time in years, he felt like the world still had color. Weeks turned into months, and Tony's pizzeria became part of their identity. They learned to slice vegetables in perfect rhythm, to mix cheese blends that melted evenly, to judge heat not by instruments but by instinct. Tony pushed them gently, demanding precision and care. "Listen to the dough," he would say. "You can feel when it's ready." Under his guidance, István rediscovered a piece of himself long buried under dust and discipline. The repetition of kneading, stretching, baking became something meditative, something human. One Sunday afternoon, Tony surprised them with a challenge. "Tomorrow we serve to the town fair. Hundreds of people. You'll be the cooks." The announcement stunned them. "Us?" István asked. "We serve Americans." Tony nodded. "You've earned it." That night, none of the men slept. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to excitement. The idea of serving their food to the public made their hearts race. It was no longer about captivity. It was about pride. The next morning at the county fair, the air was alive with music and laughter. The smell of corn butter and roasted meat drifted through the breeze. In the middle of it all stood a small booth with a sign that read, "Tony's Pizzeria," featuring the Hungarian crew. The line stretched across the grass. István stood at the oven, his face flushed from the heat, his hands moving with instinctive grace. Dough stretch sauce, spread cheese sprinkled slide into the fire. In seconds, the aroma filled the air, drawing people closer. When the first American customer took a bite, he grinned. "That's the best pizza I've ever had. You boys sure you're not Italian?" The laughter that followed was genuine. The walls between captors and captives seemed to dissolve in the heat of that moment. The prisoners worked like free men for the first time since the war began, their energy feeding the crowd as much as their food did. By sunset, they had served over 100 pizzas. The Americans applauded. Tony stood at the booth, smiling, his arms crossed with pride. "You see what happens when people cook together," he said quietly to István. "No politics, no war, just flavor." István nodded. His hands ached, his clothes smelled of smoke and flour, but his heart was light. He realized something profound. In a strange land, through strange food, he had found a truth that no speech or flag could teach him. Humanity shared more than it divided. August 1945. 10 in the morning. Rupert, Idaho. The fair was over, but the effect lingered. The Hungarian prisoners returned to Tony's kitchen the next day with quiet pride. The guards treated them differently now, not as laborers, but as craftsmen. Tony's success at the fair had spread through the small town, and people came asking about the men who made the pizzas. In a country recovering from war, their story carried something healing. Tony walked into the kitchen, holding a newspaper folded under his arm. "You're famous," he said, tossing it onto the counter. The front page carried a small picture of their fair booth beneath the headline, "Local Pizzeria Wins Hearts with European Help." The men crowded around the photo, laughing softly. For men who had once been paraded as prisoners, it felt surreal to see their work celebrated in print. István stared at the image of himself smiling behind the oven and said quietly, "In the paper back home I was listed missing." Tony looked at him. "Now you're found." Days passed into a rhythm. Mornings filled with dough preparation, afternoons with sauce making evenings with soft conversation over cooling ovens. Tony's lessons expanded beyond the kitchen. He spoke of his journey from Sicily to New York and then west to Idaho, chasing work and freedom. "In America," he said one afternoon as he rolled dough, "you don't need to be born lucky. You just need to start." Laszlo listened intently. "In Hungary, we start with permission." Tony pointed to the oven flames. "That's why this burns hotter here." The simplicity of the idea lodged deep in their minds. Freedom not as theory, but as daily practice. Every ingredient, every motion was a choice. They began to see that the pizza itself symbolized this spirit, a mix of cultures blended through necessity and imagination until it became something entirely new. As summer waned, the prisoners' routine grew more complex. Tony introduced new toppings, meats, and vegetables they had never seen. He showed them how to balance salty and sweet, soft and crisp. "Cooking is like building peace," he said. "You can't make it work if you only use one flavor." Sometimes he left them in charge of the kitchen entirely. At first they were nervous, afraid to fail, but soon they began experimenting. István created a variant using paprika and onions. inspired by goulash flavors from home. Tony tasted it, raised his eyebrows and smiled. Now that is Hungarian American. That pizza became a favorite among local customers. They called it the Magyar pie. The prisoners laughed every time someone ordered it. But inside they felt something deeper than amusement. For the first time since the war began, they had created something lasting, something that would outlive their captivity. By late August, letters began arriving from Red Cross channels, allowing prisoners to write home. István sat on his bunk one evening, drafting his first letter in years. He hesitated over what to say. How could he describe what had changed inside him? How could he explain that an Italian-American pizza maker had taught him more about humanity than any officer or general ever had? He finally wrote simply, "I have learned that food can teach peace." At Tony's insistence, the men took a group photograph outside the pizzeria before their work rotation ended. The picture showed them in white aprons, dusted with flour, standing beside Tony, who rested one arm around István's shoulder and held up a steaming pizza in his other hand. The guards in the background were smiling too. It was a frozen moment of unlikely unity. September brought cooler mornings and rumors of transfers. Some prisoners were to be sent to other work camps, others prepared for repatriation. The men gathered quietly after work, their laughter subdued. None of them wanted to leave the little pizzeria that had become a second home. On the last day, Tony cooked a final meal for them. He prepared a large pizza covered in every topping they had ever used together. When it came out of the oven, he placed it on the center table and said softly, "This one is for all of you." Every flavor, every effort, every mistake, and every success, they ate slowly, savoring each bite, not just for its taste, but for its memory. The dough carried the imprint of their hands, the sauce, their shared hours, the cheese, their laughter. When it was over, Tony shook each man's hand one by one. "You came here prisoners," he said, "but you leave as cooks. Remember that. What you've learned, no one can take from you." István looked at him. "And you, Tony, what did you learn from us?" Tony smiled, that even broken people can rise if given a little yeast and time. That evening, as the truck drove them away from Rupert, the men sat in silence, watching the lights of Tony's pizzeria fade into the distance. None of them spoke, but all carried the same thought. They had entered as prisoners and left as students of something greater. Back at Camp Rupert, the atmosphere felt different. They volunteered for kitchen duty, introducing small changes inspired by Tony's lessons. Bread loaves grew lighter, soups, richer stews more balanced. Even the American officers noticed the improvement and asked how they managed it. "We learned from Tony," István replied simply. By winter, the war had officially ended. Repatriation began in waves. One cold morning, István received notice that he would be among those returning to Europe. As he packed his few belongings, he found a folded note tucked into his apron pocket. It read, "Remember to let the dough breathe. America taught me that. Tony." The words hit him harder than he expected. They weren't about baking alone. They were about life. When the ship carrying the Hungarian prisoners docked in Europe months later, the men stepped onto familiar soil that no longer felt quite the same. Cities lay in ruined ration lines, snaked down streets, and hope was a fragile currency. But within István and his companions, something enduring glowed like an ember. He returned to Szeged to find his family home reduced to rubble. Yet, instead of despair, he saw possibility. Within weeks he found an abandoned storefront and cleaned it by hand. With scavenged bricks and borrowed wood he built a small oven. On the front window he painted a single word in uneven letters, Pizza. The first customers came out of curiosity. What was this strange round bread covered with sauce and cheese? they expected little, but when they tasted it, their faces lit up. Word spread quickly across the town. Soon, workers, students, and families filled the narrow shop, lined up for a slice of something new. István called it the Liberty Pie. He made it just as Tony had taught him, but added paprika and sour cream twists that spoke of Hungary. Each bite told a story of survival and transformation. Within a year, small pizzerias appeared in Budapest, Debrecen, and beyond each, claiming inspiration from a baker who had once been a prisoner in Idaho. The recipe spread faster than anyone could trace until it became part of the new Hungarian food identity, a bridge between the old and the new, between memory and possibility. By 1948, Hungary was a nation trying to stand again on fractured ground. Food was still rationed electricity, unreliable hope a scarce resource. Yet in one narrow street of Szeged, a small restaurant glowed each evening with the scent of baked dough and roasted tomatoes. The sign above its door read, "Farkas Pizzeria, American Style." Inside, the tables were crowded every night. Soldiers still in uniform sat beside students and old farmers, all eating with their hands, laughing, talking, forgetting for a moment that the world had broken. István moved behind the counter with the calm focus of a man who had found his purpose. His hands kneaded dough with gentle precision, just as Tony had shown him years before. When customers asked where he learned to cook this way, he smiled. "In America," he said, "from a man who believed food could change people." He had become something of a local legend. Newspapers began writing about the mysterious Hungarian baker who served an Italian-American dish in the heart of post-war Europe. They called his restaurant the most democratic table in Szeged because everyone could afford a slice. That phrase made him proud. Democracy was a new word for most Hungarians, but they understood what it meant through the warmth of that simple food. One afternoon, a journalist came to interview him. She asked what pizza meant to him. István looked out the window at the people waiting in line and said slowly, "Pizza taught me that freedom can start in an oven. You take old ingredients and make something new. You try again until it works. That is freedom." As the years passed, Farkas Pizzeria became a symbol of recovery. Former soldiers brought their families, workers brought their wages, and students came to dream over shared plates. István trained new bakers, teaching them the lessons Tony had taught him. He told them never to fear change, never to protect tradition so tightly that they strangled innovation. If you love something, he would say, you let it grow. In 1951, an American delegation visited Hungary under a cultural exchange program. Among them was a food historian who had heard rumors of a former prisoner who opened a pizzeria modeled after an Idaho restaurant. When she entered the shop, the smell overwhelmed her with nostalgia. After tasting the pizza, she asked to meet the owner. When István stepped forward, she handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a photograph of Tony DeMarco standing in front of his pizzeria, holding a pizza, just like in the one they had taken together years ago. On the back were written a few simple words, "Still baking with your spirit." István stood silently for a long moment. He realized then that the lessons they had shared had traveled farther than borders or politics. The photograph hung on the wall from that day on, where it stayed until the end of his life. By the mid-1950s, pizza had spread throughout Hungary. Bakers experimented with local ingredients, blending American imagination with Central European heart. The dish became not a symbol of foreignness, but of connection proof that cultures could merge without losing themselves. Many of those who had worked with István went on to open their own shops, spreading what they called freedom baking. Years later, when foreign journalists documented Hungary's post-war recovery, they often cited an unlikely figure among its cultural pioneers, not a politician or soldier, but a quiet baker named István Farkas, whose restaurant had become a meeting place for ordinary people, rebuilding their world slice by slice. In 1962, an elderly American couple visited Szeged. The man introduced himself as a cousin of Tony DeMarco. He had come to see the Hungarian who had carried his cousin's spirit across the ocean. When he entered Farkas' pizzeria, he smiled at the familiar warmth of the oven and the smell of garlic and basil. He sat at a table by the window and ordered the Liberty Pie. When István brought it himself, the man stood up and embraced him. "Tony would have been proud," he whispered. They talked for hours, trading stories of Tony, his humor, his stubbornness, his belief that good food could fix almost anything. Before leaving, the man handed István a folded note Tony had written before his death. It read, "If they ever forget what freedom tastes like, remind them with a pizza." That night, István stayed after closing, sitting by the fading oven light, staring at the letter. He thought about the long path from a cold barracks in Idaho to this warm kitchen in Szeged. He realized that the pizza had never just been food. It had been a language, a message across continents, teaching that creation could outlive destruction, that flavor could outlast fear. When he passed away in 1970, his apprentices continued the restaurant. Today, the original oven still stands, blackened by decades of use, but steady as ever. Generations later, people still gather there, not just to eat, but to feel a piece of history that began with a handful of prisoners learning from a kind American cook who saw humanity where others saw enemies. The story of the first American pizza to touch Hungarian hands is more than a culinary tale. It is proof that transformation can come from the simplest things, a recipe, a moment of kindness, a shared meal. In that brick oven in Idaho, 20 frightened men discovered what no battlefield could teach them, that freedom and flavor are both born from courage and imagination. If you enjoyed this story of how one simple dish bridged nations and turned captivity into connection, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more incredible true stories that reveal how small moments of humanity can change the course of history. We have many more tales where food, friendship, and courage rewrite what it means to be free. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.